Please consider joining our Patreon to help us grow, as well as like, share, comment, and subscribe.
Demons. Michael S Heiser. What the Bible really says about the powers of darkness. Guys, this is going to be a great show. I, being a skeptic, as you all know, watching my channel, I'm a very friendly guy, though. I can communicate with many people from various backgrounds, worldviews. Michael Heiser has a different worldview than me. Dr. Heiser presents evidence, though, in his book, based off the biblical narrative, that what the ancients actually believed about their own worldview is described quite well, I believe, in his book when it comes to Elohim, demons, Rephaim, giants, the whole thing. Fallen angels, the demon possessions and exorcisms, you name it. He also draws off other sources. I was shocked to read this in his book as a skeptic myself, where most Christians are shy from going towards extra biblical material. You guys will really enjoy this one.
We are MythVision. Welcome back. Your host, Derek Lambert. I have a special show today. Let me go ahead and introduce the gentleman. We're going to be talking about his book, Demons. Be sure to go to the description, get this book. It's not only readable for a layperson, but it has some depth to it, scholarly depth to it. Dr. Michael S Heiser is the executive director for the Awakening School of Theology and Ministry in Jacksonville, Florida. He is the author of numerous best-selling books, including Angels, The Unseen Realm, Supernatural, and The Bible Unfiltered. He earned his PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages and holds an MA in Ancient History and Hebrew Studies. I've watched this gentleman years and years ago on YouTube. He shot down some of the ancient alien concepts, but he piqued my interest on what's going on in the Bible in Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and other areas. So with that being said, welcome to the show, Dr. Heiser.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. You wrote this book, Demons, and when I started opening, I said, wow, this is a lot of information right on one topic. I mean, is this just going to be focused on demons itself? And there is a history to this. You need to really kind of go back and take a trip back, and you talk about something, and anyone who reads your book, which I truly recommend, I got it on ebook. If I had it hard copy, I'd be bragging right now, showing it to everybody. But it takes us through three, if you will, catastrophic events that happen in the biblical narrative: Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, finalizing at the Tower of Babel. And this worldview permeates in Deuteronomy 32, and the whole biblical narrative on top of Second Temple tradition utilizes these concepts. And so with that being said, if you would launch us off into an introduction here.
Yeah, I should ask you first, have you read Unseen Realm before you read Demons?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, for those of your listeners who may have, I should orient them a little bit. Unseen Realm is sort of the book that I'm most known for. It is a Genesis to Revelation run through. Basically, it's a systematic dot connecting. It's building the matrix, or a framework for understanding scripture for you. But it's a Genesis to Revelation work that unfolds the biblical meta-narrative, the biblical story of biblical theology, with a specific eye toward how the unseen world intentionally intersects with our world. So, my taglines for that are typically things like, I want the Israelite living in your head when you read the Old Testament. I want the first century Jew living in your head when you read the New Testament. I don't want to hear about interpreting in context anymore, unless you're willing to do it. Okay. And I'm talking worldview. So if you're filtering the Bible or interpreting your Bible in accord with, 21st century evangelicalism or the charismatic movement or the Reform guys, or, all of these things are post-biblical contexts by definition. They are not the context for the biblical writer and his original readers at any point. So,
Love that.
well, it's when you think about it, it almost sounds dumb because it's the simplest thing in the world. Okay, it's very obvious. They weren't us. News flash, okay? They weren't. And so if you have a lot of Bible under your belt, but you sort of have always suspected that there must be more to it, there must be connectivity to it that you can't see. The parts must relate to a whole, like it's supposed to make sense, so why doesn't it? Your intuition is absolutely correct, okay? And what you're missing is you're missing the framework that I tried to give you in Unseen Realm. Now, Angels is a subsequent book. Demons is a subsequent book, and those are drill downs like into the framework of Unseen Realm. If your listeners don't like to read books with footnotes, I recommend Supernatural, which is a distillation of Unseen Realm. I take all the footnotes out, all the academies and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you can go up to Amazon. I've got almost 2,200 reviews of Unseen Realm, and it's a book with footnotes, and it has sold, we're probably pushing 150,000 copies, which is unheard of for a book with footnotes. It's very rare. But what it tells you, if you read the reviews, is most of the people there are not scholars. They're just people who like the Bible. So it's very readable. And, I hope the other ones are readable too. I mean, I had good editors. But Demons, what I decided to do with Demons, Angels was first, and the title for that was intentional. And the subtitle, the book is called Angels. That's what will come up in the search engine. And then the subtitle is What the Bible Really Says About God's Heavenly Host. And that telegraphs something. It telegraphs the fact that not all members of the heavenly host are angels. Angel is just a job description. It's a term that describes what a member of the heavenly host might do, take a message, okay? It's all angel means, malach in Hebrew, angelos in Greek. Well, demons is the same way. Demons, again, that shows up in the search engines, but the subtitle is important. What the Bible really says about the powers of darkness. That means I'm trying to telegraph the idea that not all the powers of darkness are demons. They're not.
Right.
Demons are actually low-level players. If you had a conversation and you had in the room a principality and a demon, the principality might look down on the demon for not being fully divine. I mean, we'll get into why this is, but there's a pecking order that we are completely, basically unaware of.
Mm-hmm.
What we think we know about demons as students of the Bible or Christians or, anybody who's serious about the Bible, really, unless you have to go through, grad school, because all the stuff I talk about is sort of fundamental discourse, for scholars and grad school.
If you don't mind me poking in here, because
sure.
I really, really appreciate you saying that there's a pecking order here. I love that you are critical and you're honest about this, no matter who it is, what name's on it, no matter what their faith or the particular denomination is. You're like, look, here's what I found. This is the evidence.
I'm not here to shoot at anybody, and I'm not here to endorse anybody.
You're just going to the text.
Right. I have this wacky idea that I should care about what the text can sustain. That if we're going to claim our theology is biblical, it might be a good idea to actually trace it somewhere in the text, as opposed to church tradition. As much as church tradition accomplishes that's good. I mean, it's not a sinister or awful thing, but it is not biblical theology. Now, there's a lot of overlap, but the demon, the powers of darkness world is a classic example of how we think we know certain things and they're really not biblical. My favorite example is, well, what about, before the fall, when Satan fell and he took a third of the angels with him.
Right.
That's where we get the powers of darkness.
You actually answer that in your book too.
Right.
You go into.
There's no verse that says a third of the angels rebelled with Satan. Zero. I mean, there isn't a single verse that says that. If you have like a concordance or software program, if you look up 3 or third with the word angel or demon, they only occur in combination one time, and that's Revelation 12. And if you read Revelation 12, the war in heaven there is in response to the birth of the Messiah. That has nothing to do with before Adam and Eve. I mean, it's just, but we teach this. There are multitudes of Christians walking around, and this is in their head as doctrine. And it has zero attachment to the biblical text. So what I try to do is I try to get people to read the text closely in the original context of the writers and their original audience. And they are far removed from us, not only in chronology, but also in worldview. So getting into the subject matter of demons, here's how I like to introduce it to, if I'm talking to somebody or if I'm on, a show or whatever, because this comes up a lot. What's different about this book? There are other books on demons, and there are. Well, here's how I answer that. If you walk up to the average Christian and you asked, hey, can you tell me, like, theologically, biblically, why is the world such a mess? Why is there evil in God's world? Why is there such chaos? Why is there all this sin and depravity? Why is everything just a mess? Okay, and the answer you would get is probably an expression of surprise, because, well, don't you know that's the fall? Haven't you ever read your Bible, Mike? That's the fall. Well, if you ask the same question to, again, a literate Israelite, somebody who had access to a Hebrew Bible, or first century Jew, who had access to their scriptures and were very familiar with them, that is not the answer you would get. And we know that because of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know that because of things written in between the Testaments, how they're thinking about their sacred scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. That is not how they view things. And so what I'm trying to do in Demons is I'm trying to recapture how they would answer the question. And when you answer that question, then out of that emerges who the powers of darkness are, what the pecking order is, where they come from, how they're different. They're not all the same. So
yes, sir.
The answer would be, well, there's actually three reasons why the world is such a chaotic mess with all this evil, both human and supernatural. And that is, initially, there was a rebellion entered into the world in Genesis 3. That's the fall story. I'll try to abbreviate this as much as possible, where you have...
Yeah, please do.
I just get wound up, okay? You
love
have
it,
a
though.
supernatural rebellion, a supernatural rebel that later becomes known as Satan. And you have human rebellion, a violation of what God wants, from his human children. And that rebellion brings forth estrangement from God. It severs the relationship, for at least in terms of what it should be, what God wants it to be. And it also brings death, which is a serious problem. And this is why later on the Satan figure sort of gets preeminence, because by virtue of what he did, he essentially has the title to everything now. Everything dies. Everything is going to cross his doorstep or wind up in his dominion, which is the underworld, Sheol, all these terms that the Bible uses, the realm of the dead. Everything dies. So that's our first problem. Then you go on and, God doesn't annihilate the humans because he loves them. This is what he wants. And he's committed to working with them as they are, as they were created, sharing his attributes with them, one of which is freedom. He also shared his attributes with supernatural beings that he made, his heavenly children, the heavenly sons, children of God. They have freedom as well. And this is why we have evil, and you say, well, didn't God, foreknow that? Like, couldn't he tell, didn't he know that was going to happen? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. God isn't a moron, okay? He knows that when he shares his attributes with beings who are like him, but who are not him, that there's going to be a potential for failure and a potential for rebellion. But what God's choice in doing that tells us is that God would rather have a world, he would rather have us in a world that has to deal with all that than not
Dr.
have,
Heiser, if you don't mind,
us at all.
I was going to say, if you don't mind me poking in here, because we've
Sure.
got some thicker questions in terms of theological or even grammatical things, because you're a scholar in the languages and I'm not. I have a few friends that love to study this stuff who are huge fans of what you do. So I'm going to share the screen and hopefully you can see this image here, and then I'll read you the question so you can kind of get a taste of what I'm asking. All right.
Sure.
So this, if you could see that, I hope you can.
I can see it.
He says, well, my friend here, he says, Dr. Heiser, the original Greek word for demons denoted low-level polytheistic gods, lowercase, with the masculine form daimon.
Okay, I would correct that immediately.
Okay.
Daimon could indicate godlike beings. And it depends what you mean by a godlike being. In the footnotes to both Unseen Realm and the Demons book, there's an article by, last name is Rexine, and it's on daimon in Greek literature. And you'll find out there's basically half a dozen possibilities for what a daimon meant.
Okay.
One of which would be like a deity figure, and then there are different gradations. There's ghosts, there's the internal spirit of a person. I mean, all of these things could be daimon. So
You
it's
actually spell that out in your book too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a very neutral term. And the curious thing about it is that when it's used in the plural in Second Temple Greek and in the New Testament, it's always of evil beings. That is not true outside when it's used as the singular.
I think that's what his question was going to get into,
Yeah.
because he says this term took on a negative connotation in the
Yeah.
Bible with the neuter form daimonion. For some reason, later scribes in Byzantine tradition changed several instances of daimonion to the older form daimon, but in the critical text, the form daimon only occurs once in the whole New Testament. In Matthew 8:31, there's the term is used to describe what are characterized in Mark as unclean spirits, which you go into in depth in your book.
Right.
Everybody needs to read your book, first of all.
Right. The term occurs more than once. He might be referring to the singular there. I'm not sure, unless he's going daimon versus daimonion.
Yeah, he actually goes and says where Matthew has the masculine daimon, Luke has the neuter form daimonion, which he also uses in Acts 17:18. I'll finish this real quick here, where the Athenian philosophers describe Paul's gospel as preaching foreign demons. Do you believe these alternations in the form used by the biblical authors and by later scribes are significant? And what was Luke's point in having the pagan philosophers characterize Paul as preaching foreign demons?
Well, in Acts, what is it? Acts 8:31. Is that the reference?
17:18. Yes, sir.
Sorry. I don't know why I was thinking 8:31. 17:18.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, this actually sounds more familiar.
It's right where he was preaching, and they were all like, "What's a strange teachings and stuff?" You know.
Yeah. Yeah. So the term there, that he's preaching. ESV has foreign divinities. Okay. And so again, even in that instance, it doesn't necessarily refer to a negative thing. In other words, they're accusing Paul of talking about foreign gods in other words, gods that were not theirs. If it's a foreign god, it's not ours.
Right.
And who would Paul be talking about? Well, the Father and then Jesus. Okay. Because in Paul's thinking, Jesus is God incarnate. So that's the easy path. So, what they're talking about is they're essentially saying, we don't recognize these gods. Like, who are they? They're not our gods, so what's this guy talking about? What you have going on is you have the use of a term that itself is neutral. In chapter 2, or is it chapter, I think it's chapter 1. I have a couple chapters on vocabulary in the Demons book, because this is it's a problem. I wouldn't call it an insurmountable problem as far as, what's going on, but Greco-Roman literature tends to lack a lot of the nuances just generally that you're going to get with Semitic terminology, like from the Hebrew Bible. When the Hebrew Bible gets translated into Greek, the Greek translators tended to use these umbrella terms like daimon or daimonion. They didn't care about the nuancing, between, in the Angels book, I actually show that there's 3 buckets to this for members of the supernatural beings. There are terms that describe what they are by nature, ontological terms, that's the first bucket. Things like spirits, okay, Elohim even, that's a generic term for a divine being. Then there are terms that describe rank in hierarchy, sons of God. Okay, this is a term drawn from the royal court. God is king. So we use this royal court kingly, imagery to describe certain levels of the divine bureaucracy. Okay, and then the third bucket are terms that describe role or function. Basically job descriptions. Here's where angel comes in. An angel is a messenger in either Greek or Hebrew, Greek or Semitic. That's all it is. It's a messenger. So it's a supernatural being that takes a message. Okay, got
You
it.
know, this just side note, I love this because there are a lot of rationalists that want to take these things you're doing, and your whole book really is kind of like you really need to read this, guys, because they want to rationalize. They want to look at stuff like the sons of God and make it human.
Yeah.
They not divine, and you really do a great job actually criticizing that view. You really cut through
Well,
it.
I think it, you know, somebody just has to point to the elephant in the room and say, there it is. You know? Somebody
Dr.
just has to be honest, because what we have is let's just talk about, Christians, for instance. We have a lot of Christians that are selectively supernatural, and they don't understand how this undermines their apologetic position, really.
Right.
And that is, somehow it's respectable. It's not too weird to believe in a Trinity and an incarnation and the hypostatic union of the two natures of Christ. Okay, and these sort of core fundamental doctrines, virgin birth. Somehow that's intellectually fine in debates, but let's not be looking at Genesis 6. Let's not affirm with the biblical writers that the gods of the nations they believed were real entities. That's just too weird. Well, how does Genesis 6 work with the sons of God and the daughters of women, Mike? How does it work, huh? Well, here's my answer. I don't know. I don't know how it works, because just like that, I don't know how the incarnation works. I don't
Right.
know how the resurrection works. I don't know how the Trinity works.
Can I make a comment here? Because we do have limited time. And so I think this is your time is valuable to me. And I want to make sure we get to the things we need to get to. But I loved how you delved into the Babylon or the Tower of Babel, my bad, which you say might be a ziggurat. And so in this particular narrative, though, the confusion of languages, you go in and elaborate on these are actually allotted Elohim. And most Christians don't even recognize that. I feel like most Christians are stuck with the situation of there is no other gods, and they can't even permit the concept and worldview of Elohim in the framework.
This is exactly how I start the book, Unseen Realm. And it's for exactly the reason that you describe. And it's also because it involved an episode of me where God had to providentially, poke me in the eye, or basically take me down a few pegs, from where I was. Before I go into that, I don't want to leave your friend hanging, but anyway,
we got more questions. Don't worry.
With Daimonion, again, you have a transition. It's really a Greek issue, a Greek translator adopting a neutral term. And then when that term gets used in Second Temple literature, it is most often occurring in books that are referencing the Genesis 6 event. And that's why you get this sweeping, almost total universality of the daimonion, plural, are evil. It's
right.
Because that term shows up in the discussion of that event. Okay, so there's a historical consideration here. There's a literary consideration. There's also a semantic, lexical consideration here too.
Amazing.
Back to the question you just asked. So, the second rebellion involves, the sons of God, which every tradition, Jewish and Christian, up until about the 4th century AD, thought that they were supernatural beings. And it's because sons of God everywhere else, that phrase is used of supernatural beings, members of the heavenly host. And one of those is Psalm 82, where it's inescapable, because there the sons of God are also called Elohim. All right, and this is a big factor when you get in, this is what you're pressing for, the third rebellion, the Babel event. So to prep this with the whole concept of Elohim being allotted to the nations, this is how the Old Testament, the Bible, explains why the nations wind up worshiping other gods. I mean, have you ever wondered, if you're reading the Bible, you start in Genesis 1, you're reading through, by the time you hit Genesis 11, you hit Terah and Abraham. And if you do a little study on Terah, you find out in Joshua 24, he was an idolater. Well, where did that come from? How everybody sort of knew who the true God was, And then now they don't by the time of Abraham. Like, what's up with that? Again, what's up with that is the Babel event. So here's the situation. I'll start with the Babel event itself. If you read Genesis 1 through 11, again, this is the third of the three, rebellion cataclysms, the supernatural, issues, and human rebellion too. If you read Genesis 1 to 11, people are going to say, well, Mike, I don't see any demons and angels in there. I don't see anything supernatural going on there. I know the Tower of Babel story. We teach this in church, all the time. You're right. You're right. That's why you need to go to Deuteronomy 32. And I will confess with you, I was ignorant too. I was a PhD student in Hebrew Bible before I ran into this for the first time. And the reason is because when you get into grad school in Hebrew studies, they don't let you use English translations. Okay, and they insist that you use things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, that you're aware of what's going on in the text. So if you go to Deuteronomy 32:8, and I'm going to use the ESV because the ESV is one of the few English translations that incorporates Dead Sea Scroll material right in the verse. This is why I missed it for 30 years. Because your English translations don't do this. A few of them now do, ESV, NRSV, NLT. So it says, when the Most High, again, that's not a brain teaser. We know who that is.
Right.
Okay? When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind and he fixed the borders of the peoples. Well, when did all the people of the earth get divided into people groups? Oh yeah, that's the Tower of Babel. Because God confuses their languages, and we get a whole list of the nations in Genesis 10. Genesis 10 is the precursor to Genesis 11, the Babel event. It explains how we got all those nations in the table of nations in Genesis 10. So we know what he's talking about here. He's talking about Babel. Okay. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind and fixed the borders of the people, he fixed those borders according to the number of the sons of God. Whoa. See, other translations will have according to the number of the sons of Israel, or the children of Israel, the people of Israel, which, again, I can sit here and wax eloquent. I mean, I published a journal article on this that if you're having trouble sleeping, you can find it online and read it and go to sleep pretty early. It's just one of those things. I can play textual critic here all day long.
That's
and
actually
tell you why the Dead Sea Scrolls are correct. The Dead Sea Scrolls say sons of God.
right.
And if you have a study Bible, you will have a footnote here, and it'll tell you that.
Can I ask you a question on this particular subject? Because this is important. I'm popping up something for you guys to check out because this is super important in light of this. All right. So my question is, and you've written extensively in Textual Critical Problems in Deuteronomy 32:8 and 32:43, which are a microcosm of the issue of the Masoretic text priority, if you will, MT priority, the notion of the presumed sanctity of the Masoretic text in the Hebrew Bible. You seem to favor the consensus of most textual critics that these verses are corrupt in the Masoretic text, favoring readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you just got done saying, which is part of my question, but it gets into something. If you don't mind me finishing, this would be great. Greek Septuagint as being closer to the original form of the text. And obviously, these more original readings contain explicit divine counsel language, which may have been intentionally removed. Modern English translations appear to be divided on how they handle this issue, like these. Out of the 20 popular English Bibles, only 7 of them go against the Masoretic text in Deuteronomy 32:8. However, the vast majority of these Bibles, 17 out of 20, favor the Masoretic text in Deuteronomy 43. In fact, the new NET Bible Footnotes edition doesn't even provide a footnote mentioning the existence of a significant textual variant in 32:43, which is why so many of these Bibles go against the Masoretic text in verse 8 while clinging to the priority of the Masoretic text in verse 43. If scholars are correct, and this is summing it up, that the Masoretic text of verse 43 is demonstrably incomplete, missing 2 whole lines, shouldn't the Bible editor be inclined go with the scholarship on this and at least inform their readers of this issue?
Well, if you're asking me, and you are asking me, I should say yes. In a passage that is this transparently inadequate in the Masoretic text, the answer is yes. Now in the real world of Bible translation, all of these things are committee decisions. And so you might have a translator, and depending on that person's stature, within the group of people working on the translation. They may win the argument or they may not. You know, I think a lot of people, how can I say this? Because I don't want to undermine confidence in English translations, because they all do pretty well. I mean, I have preferences, you know, for different translation philosophies, but it would be unusual for one to just like, for me to look at it and say, please avoid that. I mean, I can count those on one hand. All right.
Right.
So what you more or less have is you have publishers that say things like, and I worked for one, so I know I lost this conversation internally at Logos, at Faith Life. People are just used to reading a verse a certain way, so we're going to leave it that way, and we'll put what's probably better in a footnote. That's what they're going to do. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I could fill 10 minutes of funny office stories about why that decision 10 years ago at the place I worked at is now biting them in the butt.
Yeah.
Okay. But I won't do that. You know, in this case, it's so transparent, especially because of verse 43.
Yes.
I mean, verse 43 tells you just, you know, it's just dead to rights. It is demonstrably not coherent with verse 8. But if you throw all the text criticism stuff aside, how does it make sense for the Most High at Babel to divide up the nations and allot them, you know, to the sons of God according to the number of Israel? Israel didn't exist yet. It's not in the table of nations. There is no lead to Israel. And you get people out there on the internet and say, well, you know, the number 70 is used later on. Actually, that's not the only number, but we'll just run with it. You know, later on for the children of Israel, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. I know you want to use that for verse 8. What do you got for verse 43?
Oh, nations, rejoice.
The answer is 0. Okay, you got 0. And these things are Septuagint, whatever the Hebrew text that was behind that. And the Qumran evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the only thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls for Deuteronomy 32:8. It's sons of God. But again, you don't need all the fancy schmancy academies, textual criticism, you know, all this. I mean, it's useful, it's important, but at the end of the day, if you just think about it, oh, so God allotted them to this nation that doesn't exist yet. Okay. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all, especially when you go back to Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, where the whole point is God allotting other supernatural beings to the nations and the nations to those beings as a punishment. And Israel is not supposed to involve itself with this stuff. You get it in Deuteronomy 17, they're called Elohim. You get it in Deuteronomy 29:23, again, the allotment language. This passage, not only is it the third rebellion, but this passage frames the rest of your Old Testament, and I would argue the rest of your Bible.
I actually, after reading your book, I'm telling you, very convincing. And what I love about you is you don't stay only to the canon. You venture to build up an argument that says, listen, you can go outside of your borders and see this for yourself. It's not only within the canon, it's also in Second Temple tradition. But if you don't mind, I've got 2 chunks, and then we can spend the rest of our time really kind of...
For your listeners,
yes, sir.
You know, I think books outside the canon are important for a pretty stupendous reason. You might, if you're driving, you might want to pull over on the side of the road now. So I don't want to cause an accident here with this amazing cosmic revelation. Okay, or sit down at home. But it's important to consider books outside the Bible because biblical writers read books.
What?
It's shocking, isn't it? They weren't illiterates. Okay, they read books, and they're reading people in their community that take the Hebrew Bible as the inspired sacred word of God. And so they're reading about how people in their community are thinking about it and parsing it. And occasionally, that discussion, just like when we read a commentary or something, occasionally that discussion really helps them express something. Like, what a shock.
Mm.
Again, I've sort of made a living on affirming the obvious. I mean, at the end of the day, most of what I do is affirm the obvious. And then I have to ask myself, why isn't this obvious to more people?
Mm.
And the answer is because we have been protected from our Bible. That's the answer. It gets filtered to us through tradition. It gets filtered to us by well-meaning people who have charge over us, as teachers and leaders and whatnot. And they've only been minimally exposed, again, to the same process. It's just this circular thing of passing on an interpretive subculture.
Mm.
That's what we do. And it's just high time that we try to go back and engage the text and read it like the ancient people did that produced it. God used these people when they were living. They're writing to people at the same time that think the same way. Doesn't it stand to reason that if we wanted to understand it, we would try to figure out what's going on inside their heads?
And I think you do a good job of expressing that using as much data as possible. If you don't mind, Deuteronomy 32:8, right? We've talked about this. It contains some key references to nations, which I think is important, goyim or ethne. As you know, this term tends to refer to people in general in the Hebrew Bible, but in later Hellenistic period and in Greek Septuagint, it tends to refer to nations other than Israel, and eventually becomes the term used to denote Gentiles. In verse 8, it says that God gave the nations their inheritance or allotment, dividing them geographically according to the sons of God, not the sons of Israel. And in verse 9, Jacob is said to be the allotment of God's own inheritance, which is clear, evidence right there in the verse later, which the Septuagint affirms is Israel. Now, in verse 8 of the Septuagint, God merely divides up nations. Verse 9 is only place that mentions the term inheritance with respect to Israel as God's inheritance. You ask rhetorically in one of your articles, what possible point would there be behind connecting the pagan Gentile nations numerically with the children of promise, which is kind of what you alluded to earlier. And you said, are these differences between the Masoretic text and Septuagint significant in terms of how Hellenistic Jews and later Christians may have interpreted the verses with respect to Gentiles? In other words, did Greek-speaking Jews and Christians in particular view the Gentile nations as being under the dominion of demonic powers, and did they give way to the notion that God would disinherit the demonic powers by reclaiming those Gentile nations who were separate from the people of Israel?
Yeah, the symmetry is intentional because it telegraphs reversal. And the reversal is telegraphed as soon as God punishes the nations and allots them to other, supernatural beings, in the heavenly host. Because what he does then, he has just divorced himself from humanity. I mean, think about that. There's totally. Everybody. God says, forget you, everybody. And then he turns and says, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go appear to one guy, Abram, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And his wife can't have children, so she's perfect. Because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start humanity, the human family that I want so much, I'm going to start over from scratch. And the fact that she can't have children is awesome because there's going to be no doubt as to how this people came into existence. It's going to be me. And so God does that, and he makes a covenant with Abram. But in that covenant, like right on the heels of divorcing the nations, he says, now look, it's going to be through your offspring that ultimately all these other nations are going to be blessed.
Right there in the context.
Right there from the very beginning. And so this whole thing, as it rolls out, and in Unseen Realm, I have a whole chapter on how the reversal begins at Pentecost, the reversing of Babel. And it ripples through the rest of the book of Acts. And this is how Paul frames his whole ministry. This is why he's obsessed, for instance, with getting to Spain before he dies. Well, who cares about Spain? Do they have good food there? It's
spaghetti.
It's the last nation in the table of nations that the gospel has not yet reached. I mean, he's in chains on a Roman ship headed to Rome to appeal to Caesar. There's no human hope of him getting out of there. And so what does he do? He writes a letter to the Romans and says, hey, I'm going to be coming visiting you guys for a while. I can't wait to be there. I've never been there. Heard all about you, but I'm only going to be there a little time because I'm on my way to Spain. Like twice he says it to them. And the thing is, I believe, I don't have a verse for it, but I believe that Paul believed he wouldn't die until he finished his mission.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to get to Spain because Spain is Tarshish in the table of nations. It's the westernmost point. It's also in Isaiah 66. Paul understands very clearly who he is and what his job is. I am the apostle to the Gentiles. It is my job to make sure that all of the nations that were disinherited hear about Jesus so that they have a conduit to come back home. He is the seed, as Paul says in Galatians, through which this promise is going to be fulfilled.
Right.
And he has, again, he has a clear-headed notion of what's going on. It's also reflected in his vocabulary for supernatural powers of darkness. Occasionally he'll use the neutral term demons, like when it's about a general sacrifice, or like 1 Corinthians 10, which references Deuteronomy 32, by the way.
Interesting.
But, Paul uses terms like principalities, powers, rulers, thrones, dominions, all this stuff. What do all those terms have in common? They are terms of geographical rulership and dominion. Paul is doing this for a reason. In the Demons book, I have a long quote from Plato. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes. Where
Plato beautifully articulates the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, even with allotment language. Paul could go into a Gentile town and preach Jesus. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek, and then I go to jail. Okay, but he's going to preach to them, and he knows what they're thinking. He knows that they're fearful. If we turn our backs on the gods we worship, who the bigger gods say we're supposed to worship, we're in a lot of trouble. We're going to get punished. And Paul's saying, look, the Most High, the one above all them all, the one who set up this whole arrangement as a punishment, he became a man. He died for you on the cross. He rose again. He ascended to the right hand of authority. Before he left, he said, all authority is given to me, not only in heaven, but on earth as well. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Okay, this is the trigger point right here. So Paul could say, look, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. The one who's the Most High has your back. He not only has made this legitimate, nullifying the authority of these other supernatural beings that he appointed, and then they became adversarial and rebellious. That's Psalm 82 again.
You had a gentleman who deals with the Black Hebrew Israelites, and our good friend
Vocab
Malone. I got it backwards, dyslexic there for a moment, but he was interviewed with you, and he said, and I interviewed him as well. We talked about this. These guys go to Gentiles in the New Testament, and they see the term, and they believe that it's like a Hellenized, uncircumcised Israelite. Somehow there's a genetic connection to all of Paul's, Cornelius, the whole nine, and they just can't see the framework stretch out beyond the 12. They go beyond heaven and earth to interpret it this way. And then, of course, they say they themselves are that specific race.
Right.
But
and at the end of the day, if this barrier, this wall of separation has been torn away by Jesus, why are you trying to reconstruct it? What's the point?
If you don't mind, I want to segue into more because I've got limited time with you, and because there's so much here. I'd love to interview you again to go into more detail. You have so much information. I'm going to share an image. This is a textual issue, I think, that my buddy Stephen Nelson brought to my attention, and so let me pull this up. I'm dealing with multiple things on my screen. Here we go. Sharing screen now. All right. Can you see that, sir?
I can see it. It's large, so I don't see all of it. But
okay. Let's see. You cannot see all of it?
I can see cleanse his people's land. That's the last line.
cleanse his people's land. Yes, that's the bottom. So
Okay.
I'll read the question here. In Deuteronomy 32:43, what is the significance of the line where the Septuagint and Masoretic text agree against the Dead Sea Scrolls? Rejoice, O nations, with his people. That verse seems to draw a distinction between nations, goyim, and people, amim. The Septuagint reinforces this distinction by rendering goyim as ethne and amim as laos. If the latter reference is to the people of Israel and the former reference is to Gentiles, was this verse understood by Christians as a prophecy of the salvation of Gentiles? Might the deletion of this line from the Dead Sea Scroll, 4Q Deuteronomy, indicate that the editor of the text was uncomfortable with the idea of Gentiles somehow coming into the fold with Israel? Or is it more likely that this line was later interpolated into the textual stream now reflected in the Masoretic and Septuagint text?
Yeah, I don't see how. To me, let me preface it this way. It's conceivable that you could have more than one hand copying a Hebrew Bible. In other words, that you wouldn't have the same guy copy everything.
Right.
All right. Now, just store that away. So that you would have, different people working on different portions of this Tanakh that was being reproduced and copied. I bring that up because if there was some sort of supervised agenda to do, to edit the Hebrew text because I'm offended with the idea of Gentiles being, grafted into the family of God or Israel or something like that, you did a really sucky job. Every scribe did a really sucky job because this theme runs through the Hebrew Bible in lots of places. So, if your job is to the New Testament and get rid of the deity of Christ, I don't think the Jehovah's Witnesses are going to hire you because you're inept. You're not going to do a very good job. Now, having said that, is it possible that one scribe, looked at, had the text of Deuteronomy 32 that aligns with the Septuagint and decided to take it out? Well, okay, that's possible. I don't know that it's really plausible. I also don't even know if it's a meaningful question because the Hebrew Bible is getting copied not just in one geographical place. The Hebrew Bible is being copied in at least 3 different locations. You got Babylon. There's a whole huge, substantial Jewish community in Babylon, and they're not sitting there hoping that someone will invent Federal Express so that they can get a Hebrew Bible in their synagogue someday. Those idiots in Judea, I wish they'd hurry up and then someone please invent a method to mail it over here. No, they're doing it themselves.
Right.
And they're doing the same thing in Egypt, which is where the Septuagint was done. So there's a Hebrew text there, and there's one in Judea. I mean, you have 3 major geographical areas of text transmission. And so the notion that there's a concerted effort to try to fiddle with the Masoretic text or the Hebrew text to get rid of this one point is, to me, it's almost as implausible as me winning the next American Idol, but not quite. Okay.
You might win, though. I mean,
it's on the implausibility scale because these are the kinds of things that we imagine in our heads because we're not there at the place and time. We don't appreciate the fact that all this copying is going on in more than one location by multiple hands. There is no puppet master, supervising what's done here. Now, having said all of that, the only time in history when you get something that approximates a concerted effort to produce a Hebrew text that these sorts of decisions are going to be made is the creation of the Masoretic text as we know it in about 100 AD. So up until that point, there is textual plurality. So this is where it becomes conceivable, but whoever did it their supervisor ought to be fired because they didn't do it everywhere else. So even if they did it
Right.
at 100 AD, dude, haven't you read the rest of your Bible? I mean, if you want to get rid of this thought, you got to do a good job. And they didn't. So that would be the point where I think it's conceivable, that something like this could be done. I think this is important. This discussion is important for a different reason than probably the question is being asked. And that is in critical approaches, in source critical approaches, which want to argue that, the biblical writers used to be polytheists and then evolved to the wonderful breakthrough, the ascended idea of monotheism. They will use Deuteronomy 32:8 to say, at some point, they got rid of the other gods and because they wanted to be monotheists. And they'll talk about how the text was edited during the exile or something like this, after they've suffered for apostasy. We got to get this out of our systems and blah, 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 blah. Look, we don't know when this was done. All we know is that the text that's behind the Septuagint, that is witnessed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, had sons of God. There's only really one conceivable time when we know this would happen, and it's way after the exile. You've had 500 years of people not caring about plural Elohim within the Jewish community. This is why I wrote the article, and it's publicly available online. The whole thing about divine plurality in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are over 160 references to plural Elohim in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A dozen of them or so are in divine council context. I'm sorry, but that is not an indication of polytheism. Okay, these guys separated from the Pharisees. Okay, they're not liberals.
Right. They're very...
It doesn't make any sense at all, but you'll read this in scholarship. It's kind of the scholarly equivalent of the Revelation 12, third of the angels thing. Nobody ever stops to ask or waves the flag like, hey, what? This doesn't make any sense. I did that in my dissertation, and to my advisor's credit, he let me do that. I don't know if he bought it at the end or not, but this was an issue. And he could see that he was an honest guy, and that's really all you want in a doctoral program. Somebody who'll just be honest with you.
I mean, if the biblical authors,
I think the whole editorial question is important in both respects. There's no way that we can posit some sort of chronology or timeline or comprehensive systematic effort to do X, Y, or Z. Again, the only time that even sounds like it's worth talking about is at about 100. And whoever did it, good grief.
So Dr. Heiser, this is interesting stuff that you're bringing up here. And I guess I wanted to save the juicy stuff for last for our audience that are listening. And you know what I mean when I say juicy. Rephaim, the giants, the background, the Mesopotamian background, the Apkalu. I believe I'm pronouncing this correct. And what I loved about what you did in Demons is you bring up that only 2 other scholars have actually written on this.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's just amazing.
Can you tell us a little brief what's going on, like be in the background? Who are these watchers and things like that?
There's so much that could be said here. Genesis 6:1 through 4, we are taught to not see anything supernatural going on there. Contrary to biblical period all the way up through, 400 AD, just in round numbers. There's nothing to see here. The gods here, the sons of God, those are just people. Even though they're not other places, here they are because it's just too weird to say they're supernatural. We ignore that Peter refers to angels, plural, that sinned at the time of the flood. And there is no other candidate. Remember, a third of the angels did not rebel with Satan. There's no verse for that. Okay, there is no other candidate. So he took them as supernatural beings. He uses the verb to send to Tartarus, which is, in the classical Greek version of this, this whole series of events. There are a number of indications these are supernatural beings. In the Jewish tradition, from this episode, everybody likes to talk about the Nephilim and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. But where it gets really strange is if you walked up to again, a first century Jew and say, hey, where do demons come from? I'm reading my Hebrew Bible. I just can't find like a passage that explains where they come from. And he would say, you dunderhead, don't you know that the demons are the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim and their descendants? And we hear that and we think that is just crazy town. Okay, like where in the world can you find that? All right, let's be a little charitable here. They're looking at their Hebrew Bible. They're not just like, we need a new thought to think for the community that doesn't have any attachment to our sacred text. And then we're going to call it doctrine. So what can we, they're not doing that. Where they're getting it is they're getting it in passages like Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 32, where you have Rephaim or Nephilim, just in Sheol, in the underworld. So Israelite tradition, the Hebrew Bible is the only one that uses these terms for both giants and for denizens of the underworld. And so all they're doing is putting the dots together. They're connecting the dots. This is why you read all about this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why you read about it in First Enoch. By the time you get to Jesus' day, this is like, everybody knows this. Everybody knows this because they are riffing off these underworld passages. And so, you say, well, that's still kind of crazy town. I don't see that in Genesis 6. You know what else you don't see in Genesis 6? You don't see what Peter says, do you? Okay, yes, he has angels that sin, but they're kept in chains of gloomy darkness.
Right.
You don't find that in Genesis 6 either. So the question is, where's Peter getting it? Peter's getting it from two places. He's getting it from classical literature. We know that because he references Tartarus. He's aware of that. And he also gets it from books like Enoch and other Dead Sea Scrolls. And you know where they got it? See, that's the next question.
That's what I want to find
right.
out. Yeah.
That's the next question.
The
Where do
juicy
they
stuff.
get it?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it in these places? It's because whoever produced the books of Enoch and the Book of the Giants and the Genesis Apocryphon, and again, some of these famous Dead Sea Scrolls, they knew the Mesopotamian backstory. And the Mesopotamian backstory is the Apkallu or the Apkallu. It's the story of how the bigger gods want to destroy humans at the flood, and the Apkallu are horrified. Like, we put a lot of time into these people. We're the ones who gave them the knowledge on how to make civilization and all this great stuff. And so what they do is they come up with a plan to preserve the knowledge of civilization for the surviving humans of the flood. And all that we're told in cuneiform texts is that before the flood, the Apkallu are 100% divine. After the flood, they're not. They are of human descent, or they're 2/3, divine, or something like that. Gilgamesh is one of the lords of the Apkallu. Gilgamesh is referenced by name in the Book of the Giants, okay, from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sorry, they know this material, and if you read Demons, you're going to find out that every point of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, really 1 through 5, because the big issue is that they teach humans all this knowledge that for a Babylonian, this is great. This is why you're our heroes, because they don't mind idolatry, they don't mind warfare, they don't mind, astrology, they don't mind, arts of seduction because they don't have, the morals of the Torah. They don't mind any of this. But for the biblical writers, they're saying, no, this is bad. Mm-hmm. This is why the depravity of humanity was accelerated after the flood. It's because of these guys and what they did and what they taught humans to basically do it more effectively, destroy themselves. So Genesis 6, 1 through 5 is a response. It's a polemic against Mesopotamian Babylonian theology. And the writers of Enoch and the Book of the Giants and these other texts understood that. And that's why they have it in their texts. And Peter, again, pulls some of these threads, in his own book, to make certain points. Why do you think that Peter and Jude, the two writers that mentioned the weird Genesis 6 thing, why are they talking about false teachers when they bring this up? Could it be that it has to do with the knowledge that the Watchers or the Apkallu, the sons of God, taught humans to accelerate their depravity? Could that be why Peter and Jude associate false teaching with angels that sin?
Interesting.
again, there are these, once you see the connection and you think about the context for it, it's like the most obvious thing in the world. But nobody does that.
No, and that's, in fact, after reading your book, when I go back to the Bible, the framework, like the whole framework, is radically reconsidered, because we're so used to looking at it human this, human that, not really recognizing, like, the only picture we have of divine is the God of Israel. Like, that's the only thing, is just God, and not seeing how important this metaphysical, so to speak, realm of beings.
Think of how the traditional view makes God a liar. Okay, this night I will have victory over the gods of Egypt. I mean, that's what the Lord says at Passover. So if he really knows that they don't exist, how does he have integrity in that statement? Oh, well, Mike, he means God's gonna beat those idols. Well, that's nice. I could take a hammer and beat the idol too. You know, I could turn it over. I could tear it down. I could melt its objects. How does that give God any glory? When the Bible says that Yahweh is the God of all gods, the Elohim, I mean, he is the Lord of all gods, the King of all gods. These titles that Yahweh gets a couple dozen times. Do they mean what they say? Okay, or is Yahweh the God of beings that don't really exist? Again, newsflash, I'm better than a being that doesn't exist. At least I do exist.
Right. I hope so. No, you said something good in the book about divine God kings. And so you actually kind of point out and you criticize that and say, hey, look, you want to try and use that route of, well, these are just kings, human kings that were statused as gods. And you deal with that. So anyone who's interested in wanting to know how Dr. Heiser deals with this in his book, make sure you guys go down in the description. Be sure to get Demons. I don't care who you are. I think you'll really learn something very interesting from this book. I definitely did. And it made me kind of want to reconsider looking into these this Deuteronomy 32 worldview throughout the biblical narrative, because I actually communicate with a lot of people who have different views, lots of different ideas. And one of them is kind of in that vein of what the Black Hebrew Israelites have, Israel only type ideas. And I'm testing it out, right? I look at things like in Matthew where it says he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? They use these onlys and they like kind of have this fundamentalist approach on it, and they say, see, and they paint everything with those.
Don't look at John 10.
Right. They don't really check out. They want to paint Matthew 15 or Matthew 10 on John 10 or Revelation 7. They'll say stuff like, the 12,000 from the 12 tribes.
Don't read Isaiah 66 about the Gentiles being priests of the house of the Lord. Don't read that stuff.
Yeah.
Whatever you do,
get a black permanent marker. Don't use a highlighter, just permanent marker. Well, Dr. Heiser, this has been a wonderful interview. I think we have many more we can do in the future. I got to read your other books. We got to definitely go into those, Unseen Realm and Angels, all that stuff. Thank you for taking the time to come out here and talk with me on this. I really do appreciate
absolutely.
it. With that being said, I guess there's so many more notes on this book. If you have the time at some point, maybe I'll leave this one be, because I think people need to read it. There's so much material. I actually have pages of notes.
Wait and see how much hate email you get.
I'm definitely going to get some. I was going to ask about the Azazel sacrifice, demons as pestilence, the wilderness, underworld. There's so much here. The Egyptian god Pan.
I would say for your listeners again, there are so many nuggets that are just, it's so many things just running underneath the surface of your English Bible. But what I really want people to get is that all of these data points connect. Like they actually do. All the weird stuff, that we've talked about and stuff we haven't, it all has a role to play in how the biblical meta-narrative, the biblical story is told, and why it's told that way. and that's what we're missing. We have a lot of people who, and God bless them. I mean, I'd want, for every one person who cares about the text that doesn't agree with me, I'll take 10 of those, as opposed to, the people who don't care at all. Just give me those people, that's what I want. But we have a lot of people who have a lot of data points in their head, but they have no framework into which they fit. And they can't see the trajectories that will just run from Genesis to Revelation. They can't see how things connect to each other. So again, in Unseen Realm, I try to build enough of the matrix that you can function in it. And then with these other books, I'm trying to drill down and then, okay, let's take this topic and expand it. Let's take this topic and expand it. So there is, even if people can't tell, there actually is a strategy.
I thought there was. It turned out well. May I read one excerpt from your book?
Sure.
All right. So, in effect, Satan was offering Jesus rule over the nations abandoned by Yahweh at Babel, Deuteronomy 32:8. That judgment was never intended to be permanent. When Yahweh raised up his own portion, Deuteronomy 32:9, Israel, starting with the covenant with Abraham, he told the patriot that it would be through his offspring that all nations would ultimately be blessed, Genesis 12:3. Jesus was the specific fulfillment of that promise. Now, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ, Galatians 3:16. Had Jesus failed in the wilderness temptation, the plan to bring back the nations into the family of Yahweh also would have failed. The nature of this temptation and the implications of its outcome presume the Second Temple Jewish perception we discovered earlier, that the rebellious gods of the nations were affiliated with the original rebel of the Eden and in some sense under his authority. When the Gospels have Satan offering the kingdoms of the world to Jesus in exchange for worship, they presume this affiliation and authority. Michael Heiser, thank you so much, brother.
Yeah, thank you.
And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, we are MythVision.